At the dinner table,
I will
Chloe
make you
Petit leans
disappear
in
without
toward
trace.
Jae-yoon, her beauty sharp and calculating. With a smug smile, she whispers a death threat in French. Bientôt tu seras sous terre, et ton empire sera à moi et à Rodrigo. Meurs rapidement, pauvre infirme. Meaning, soon you'll be under the dirt, and your empire will be mine and Rodrigo's. Die quickly, you pathetic cripple. The malicious words cut through the room's tension. Behind them, Ashley Noble stands motionless, her dark skin glowing under the chandelier. A spoon slips from her hands, clattering against the marble floor. In fluent French, Ashley's voice cuts through the silence. Les couverts entendent tout, Mademoiselle Petit, et moi aussi. Meaning, the silverware hears everything, Mademoiselle Petit, and so do I. Chloe freezes, her face draining of color. Jae-yoon watches silently, the power dynamics now irrevocably shifted. Before I tell you next whether Chloe succeeded in her evil plans and the final fate of Jae-yoon, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. This video will teach you to love carefully, as some friends are actually frenemies. Now let's dive into it. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Kong estate, but for Ashley Noble, the light only served to highlight the dust motes she was tasked with chasing. To Chloe Petit, Ashley was not a woman with a master's degree in linguistics or a daughter sending every one back to her family. She was simply a moving part of the architecture, an appliance in a black and white uniform. "He is so incredibly tedious, Rodrigo." Chloe's voice drifted from the cheese lounge, sharp and melodic like shattering glass. She spoke in her native French, her tone dripping with a casual cruelty she never bothered to hide. She assumed the mahogany-skinned woman polishing the silver nearby was as deaf to her language as she was to her humanity. "Watching him wheel himself around this mausoleum, it's like watching a spider with broken legs. It's pathetic." Ashley's hand paused for a fraction of a second on the silver teapot, her heart stuttering. She kept her head down, her reflection in the polished metal showing only a mask of professional indifference. Tedious, pathetic. The words stung, not for herself, but for Jae-yoon. She had seen the way the broken boss stared out at the city at night, the quiet dignity he maintained despite the whispers of his own men. "Patience, ma chérie," a low masculine voice responded. Rodrigo, Jae-yoon's most trusted advisor and supposed best friend, stepped into the room. He didn't even glance at Ashley as he leaned down to press a lingering illicit kiss to Chloe's neck. "The assets are almost liquidated. Once the accident is staged, we'll be dining in Le Marais, and Jae-yoon will be nothing but a tragic memory and a massive life insurance payout." Chloe giggled, a sound that made Ashley's skin crawl. "I can't wait to leave this gray city. And his father? The old man looks at me like he can smell the Chanel on my skin and the contempt in my heart. He's suspicious, Rodrigo. We have to move fast." Ashley moved to the far corner of the room, meticulously dusting a bookshelf she had already cleaned twice. She was a ghost in the room, a silent witness to a cold-blooded conspiracy. Every word of their French dialogue burned into her mind like acid. They spoke of the hidden cameras they'd bypassed, the way they drugged Jae-yoon's evening tea to keep him lethargic, and the sheer joy they took in his perceived helplessness. "The maid," Rodrigo said, suddenly, his eyes flickering toward Ashley the first time. "Does she understand anything?" Chloe didn't even bother to look up from her manicure. "The American, please. She can barely navigate the subway system. She is just a decorative shadow. She understands clean and go, and that's the extent of her world." Ashley squeezed the microfiber cloth in her hand, her knuckles turning a lighter shade of brown. She felt a surge of cold, sharp clarity. They thought she was a shadow, but shadows were the best place to hide a secret. As Chloe went back to describing the penthouse they would buy in Paris with Jae-yoon's blood money, Ashley realized her visa wasn't her biggest problem anymore. She was the only person in the world who knew the king was being poisoned by his queen, and she knew exactly how to translate their betrayal into his survival. The heavy oak doors of the study groaned as Chairman Jae-hoon entered, his presence carrying the weight of a man who had built an empire on blood and iron. Ashley stood in the shadows near the bar cart, her movements silent as she prepared a glass of traditional tea. She felt the chairman's sharp, discerning gaze flicker toward her for a moment, not with Chloe's dismissive contempt, but with the weary suspicion of an old lion, before he turned his attention to his son. Jae-yoon sat slumped in his wheelchair, the picture of a man hollowed out by misfortune. His eyes were glazed, staring blankly at the unlit fireplace, his hands resting limp and pale against the black fabric of his slacks. It was a performance so convincing that Ashley felt a pang of protectiveness in her chest, knowing the vibrant, calculated mind that was currently holding itself in check. "You look like a ghost of the man I raised," the chairman grumbled, his voice a low rasp. He paced the room, his expensive loafers clicking rhythmically on the marble. He stopped abruptly near Jae-yoon's chair, his shadow looming over his son. "I did not come here to offer pity, Jae-yoon. I came to offer a warning. You are blinded by your own misery, and it is making you vulnerable." Jae-yoon didn't blink. "I have nothing left to protect, father," he whispered, his voice thin and fragile. "Let the world take what it wants. I am already broken." The chairman slammed a fist onto the mahogany desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Listen to me. Your best friend, Rodrigo, and that French woman, they are circling you like vultures. I see the way they look at each other when they think no one is watching. They are too close, Jae-yoon, too comfortable in your house, with your money, and with your secrets. Rodrigo is managing your assets with a hand that is far too eager, and Chloe, she treats this estate as if she has already inherited it." From the corner of the room, Ashley carefully placed the tea on a tray. She saw Jae-yoon's jaw tighten for a split second, the only true red flag he allowed himself to show. But when he spoke, the mask of depression was back in place. "Chloe is the only reason I have to wake up," Jae-yoon said, a scripted lie that tasted like poison in the air. "And Rodrigo has been my brother since we were boys. You see shadows where there are none, father. You were always too paranoid." "I am a survivor," the chairman roared, his face reddening. He leaned down, his eyes inches from his son. "That woman is a snake in silk, and your brother is sharpening the knife. If you do not wake up, you will not live to see the next moon. Protect the dynasty, Jae-yoon. Protect yourself." The chairman turned on his heel and marched out, his aura of disappointment leaving a vacuum in the room. Jae-yoon remained still, the silence stretching long and heavy. Only when the outer doors clicked shut did his posture shift. His spine straightened, and his eyes regained their predatory sharpness. He didn't turn around, but his voice was now steady and cold as it cut through the gloom. "Did you hear him, Ashley?" Ashley stepped forward, the silver tray balanced with newfound purpose. "I did, sir," she replied in her natural, confident tone. "Your father sees the fire. He just doesn't know that you're the one holding the match." Jae-yoon finally looked at her, a dark, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Then let them burn a little longer. We need them to feel safe before we strike."
The silence that followed the chairman's departure was not empty. It was heavy with the memory of the night the world had truly fractured for Jae-yoon. As Ashley stood by the bar cart, she saw his gaze drift, not to the fireplace, but to the small, inconspicuous vent near the ceiling where a single lens had once been concealed. 6 months ago, before the wheelchair and the carefully curated mask of despair, Jae-yoon had sat in this very room, nursing a glass of neat whiskey and reviewing security feeds. He had expected to see a delivery or perhaps a late-night guard rotation. Instead, the screen had flickered to life with a graininess that couldn't hide the truth. He had watched, his blood turning to ice as the heavy doors of his private suite swung open. Rodrigo, the man who had been his blood brother since their days in the military, had entered with a familiarity that suggested he had done this many times before. Seconds later, Chloe had followed. She wasn't wearing the mask of the devoted, worried fiancé she presented to the world. She was laughing, her melodic and cruel as she draped herself over Rodrigo. On the silent footage, Jae-yoon had watched them embrace, a betrayal caught in high definition. He had seen Rodrigo's hand resting on the very desk where the syndicate's ledgers were kept, his mouth moving in what Jae-yoon now realized were calculations of theft. Chloe's face had been alight with a greed so pure it was terrifying. She didn't love the man in the wheelchair. She was simply waiting for him to occupy it permanently. The physical accident that followed weeks later, a high-speed brake failure on a rain-slicked mountain road, had been real enough in intent, but Jae-yoon had survived it with nothing more than a few fractured ribs and a cold, crystalline clarity. When he woke in the hospital, seeing Chloe and Rodrigo standing at his bedside with rehearsed expressions of grief, he had made a split-second decision. He didn't reveal that he could feel his legs. He didn't tell them the surgery had been a success.
He had realized then that as long as he was the powerful, untouchable Mafia boss, they would remain in the shadows, striking only when his back was turned. But if he became the crippled boss, a man supposedly broken, impotent, and drowning in self-pity, they would grow bold. They would become loud. They would stop whispering and start shouting their plans, assuming the man in the chair was too far gone to hear them. The wheelchair was not a cage. It was a blind. It was the only way to lure the vipers out into the open so he could crush their heads at once. Back in the present, Jae-yoon's fingers gripped the armrests of his chair with a strength that would have terrified Chloe. He looked up at Ashley, the only person who had looked past the metal in the wheels to see the predator underneath. The footage of that night lived in a secure drive, a digital noose he was slowly tightening. "They think they are the ones watching me," Jae-yoon murmured, his voice returning from the memory with a sharpened edge. "They think they are the ones writing the ending to this story. But they forget that I am the one who owns the house, the cameras, and the truth." The following afternoon, the estate felt uncharacteristically hollow, a silent vessel for the secrets beginning to leak from its corners. Ashley moved through the second-floor corridor, her footsteps swallowed by the plush Persian runners. She carried a stack of fresh linens, her expression a mask of dutiful service, but her senses were tuned to the vibration of voices coming from the sun-drenched terrace. Through the partially open glass doors, she caught the sharp, rhythmic cadence of French. It was Chloe. Ashley stepped into a recessed alcove, pressing her back against the cool marble wainscoting. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers finding her smartphone. With a practiced silent swipe, she activated the voice recorder. The device sat nestled in the fabric, its microphone angled toward the terrace, capturing the wind and the chilling clarity of a death sentence. "The dosage is too low, Rodrigo," Chloe was saying, her voice thin with irritation. "He's still too lucid. Yesterday he looked at me, really looked at me, and for a moment I thought he knew. We cannot wait for him to simply fade away." "The documents are ready," Rodrigo's voice followed, sounding closer, more intimate.
I've diverted the final offshore accounts. Once he signs the medical power of attorney tomorrow, we can trigger the final event, a tragic heart failure in his sleep. The doctors I've hired won't look twice at a crippled man with a broken heart." Ashley's breath hitched, but she forced herself to remain as still as a statue. The silver tray in her mind was trembling, but her physical hands were iron.
"And then?" Chloe asked, her tone shifting to a breathless, girlish excitement. "Paris? I've already contacted the realtor for the place on Avenue Montaigne. I want to see the Eiffel Tower from my bedroom, not this dismal skyline." "Paris," Rodrigo confirmed. "We sell the remaining real estate, liquidate the shell companies, and disappear before his father can even bury him. He'll be a headline for a day, and we'll be ghosts in the city of light." They began to laugh, a low conspiratorial sound that made Ashley's skin crawl. It was the sound of two people who had already spent the money of a man they hadn't yet killed. Ashley waited until she heard the clinking of champagne flutes before she retreated, sliding back into the shadows of the hallway with the weight of a digital bomb in her pocket. She didn't return to the kitchen. Instead, she navigated the back servants' stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had the proof. She had the names, the dates, and the cold-blooded intent recorded in the very language they thought was their sanctuary. As she reached the door to Jae-yoon's private study, she paused, checking the hallway for Chloe's sharp eyes or Rodrigo's predatory shadow. The recording was a tether, connecting her fate to the man in the wheelchair. She wasn't just a domestic worker anymore. She was the bearer of the truth, and the time for silence had officially come to an end. She reached for the brass handle, the phone heavy in her palm, ready to show the king that his kingdom was already under siege. The moon hung low over the Seoul skyline, casting long skeletal shadows across the Kong estate as Ashley made her way toward the master wing. The house was deceptively still, the air thick with the artificial floral scent of Chloe's perfume, which seemed to cling to the walls like a lingering threat. Ashley's hand hovered over the heavy oak door of Jae-yoon's study, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a whistleblower in a house of assassins. Inside, the room was bathed in the amber glow of a single desk lamp. Jae-yoon sat in his wheelchair, silhouetted against the window, a figure of solitary desolation. He didn't turn when she entered. "It's late, Ashley. You should be resting." "I couldn't rest, sir. Not after what I heard." Ashley stepped into the circle of light, her mahogany skin glowing under the lamp. She didn't offer him tea or towels. Instead, she placed her phone on the mahogany desk between them. Without a word, she pressed play. The room was suddenly filled with the sharp, melodic cadence of French. Chloe's voice, cold and predatory, discussed the liquidation of assets, the tragic heart failure, and the shared future in Paris with Rodrigo. As the recording played, Ashley watched Jae-yoon's profile. His expression didn't shatter. It hardened, his features turning into a mask of cold, crystalline fury. When the recording ended, a heavy silence descended. Ashley cleared her throat, her voice steady and low. "Il pense que vous êtes un pion, Monsieur Jae-yoon," she said, her French accent flawless and elegant. "Mais ils ont oublié que les ombres ont des oreilles." Jae-yoon's head snapped toward her, his dark eyes widening in genuine shock. For the first time, the mask of the broken boss slipped. "You speak French," he stated, his voice a low growl of realization. 4 years in Paris as a translator before my life brought me here," she replied, meeting his gaze. "I've understood every word she has said about you and every plan they've made against you." Then the world seemed to tilt.
Jae-yoon's hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning white. With a slow, fluid motion that defied every medical report in the house, he pushed himself upward. Ashley gasped, taking an instinctive step back as he rose to his full, imposing height. He stood before her, tall and predatory, the supposed paralysis vanishing like a ghost. You're not?" Ashley's voice trailed off in disbelief. "I've been waiting," Jae-yoon said, his voice now vibrating with power. He took a step toward her, his movements graceful and dangerous. "Waiting for a reason to trust someone in this house of vipers. My father was right about the fire, but I needed a witness." He looked down at her, his intense gaze locking onto hers. "They want a tragedy, Ashley. Let's give them a masterpiece instead. We play their game. You remain the invisible maid, and I remain the crippled boss. But from this moment, you are the only person who knows the king is standing." Ashley felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and profound purpose. She looked at the man who had been her silent charge and saw a partner. She nodded slowly, her hand finding his in a silent, ironclad pact. The broken boss and the invisible maid were gone. In their place stood an alliance that would turn the City of Light into a funeral pyre for the traitors. The breakfast room was a stage of high-tension theater, the morning air thick with the scent of jasmine tea and simmering resentment. Jae-yoon sat in his wheelchair at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, while Chloe sat opposite him, her eyes glued to her phone as she mentally cataloged the assets she planned to steal. Ashley moved with practiced grace in the background, setting down a porcelain cup with a precision that was now part of a larger, deadlier game.
As Chloe swept out of the room, her heels clicking like a countdown, Ashley let out a slow, steady breath. The bait had been taken. The threat had been recorded. The trap was almost ready to spring. The atmosphere in Chairman Jae-hoon's private office was stifling, the air thick with the scent of old tobacco and the unyielding weight of tradition. The elder man sat behind his desk, a monolith of silver-haired authority, watching Ashley with eyes that had seen 1,000 betrayals. He did not ask her to sit. In his world, she was still a servant, an outsider whose presence in his sanctum was a breach of protocol. Ashley did not falter. She stood before him, the silver tray she usually carried, replaced by a single, sleek digital tablet. Her posture was straight, her dark skin luminous against the white of her collar, radiating a quiet, unshakable dignity. "Chairman," she began, her voice steady, "you spoke of shadows and vipers. I'm here to show you the light." Without waiting for permission, she tapped the screen. The room was suddenly filled with the sharp, rhythmic cadence of Chloe and Rodrigo's voices. The chairman's face, initially a mask of stony indifference, shifted into a map of thunderous fury as he heard the detailed mechanics of the accident and the plan to liquidate the Kong legacy. The recording continued, moving to the terrace conversation, where Chloe openly mocked the chairman's suspicions, calling him a senile old lion who would be silenced along with his son. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was deafening. The chairman's hands, weathered and powerful, gripped the edge of his desk until the wood groaned. He looked at the tablet, then up at Ashley, his gaze piercing. "You understood them," he stated, his voice a low vibration. "The French. All this time they spoke their treason in front of you, thinking you were a fool. They see only what they want to see, sir. They saw a maid. They didn't see a woman who cares for your son's life more than her own safety." The chairman stood slowly, his stature reclaiming the room. He walked around the desk, stopping mere inches from Ashley. For a long moment, he searched her face, looking for the greed or the calculation he was so accustomed to.
He found only a fierce protective loyalty, a good heart that had survived the cynicism of the Mafia world. My son has spent his life surrounded by people who claim to love him while reaching for his pockets, the chairman said, his voice surprisingly soft. He reached out, his hand hovering briefly over the tablet before he looked Ashley in the eye. I warned him to protect the dynasty. I didn't realize the dynasty's greatest shield would be a woman Chloe Petit was too arrogant to notice. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect so rare it felt like a tectonic shift in the estate's power structure. You have done what my own soldiers could not.
You have brought me the truth. Chloe is a parasite, but you are a lioness. He stepped back, his expression hardening with a new singular purpose. Save my son, Ashley. You have my blessing, my resources, and my word. When the dust settles, this family will finally have a queen worthy of the name. Ashley nodded, the weight of the alliance settling onto her shoulders. She had won the father. Now she just had to survive the final act of the children. The final evening arrived with a deceptive velvet stillness that blanketed the Kong estate. In the grand dining hall, the air was thick with the scent of lilies, a choice Chloe had insisted upon, claiming they were elegant, though Ashley knew they were the flowers of a funeral. Chloe sat draped in a blood-red silk gown, her eyes gleaming with a feverish anticipation as she watched Jae-yoon. Beside her, Rodrigo maintained a mask of somber loyalty, though his fingers toyed restlessly with a heavy glass of scotch. The stage was set for the accident. Rodrigo had already tampered with the hydraulic lift of the transport van, and Chloe had personally stirred a lethal sedative into Jae-yoon's evening tea. They exchanged a subtle, triumphant glance across the table, a silent toast to the Paris skyline they imagined they would be seeing by dawn. "You look tired, mon chéri," Chloe murmured in French, her voice a poisonous caress. "Drink your tea. It will help you sleep. Deeply." Jae-yoon sat in his wheelchair, his head bowed, his posture radiating the very frailty they had come to rely on. He reached for the cup, his hand trembling with a practiced weakness. But just as the porcelain rim touched his lips, he paused. The silence in the room grew heavy, pressurized by a shift in the atmosphere that Chloe and Rodrigo were too arrogant to sense until it was too late. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and died, plunging the hall into a terrifying, visceral darkness. Before Chloe could scream, the room's surround sound system roared to life. It wasn't music that filled the space, but the sharp, unmistakable clarity of a phone recording. "The dosage is too low, Rodrigo. We cannot wait for him to simply fade away." Chloe's own voice echoed off the marble walls, stripped of its elegance and revealed in its raw, murderous intent. Then came Rodrigo's response, booming through the speakers like a judge's gavel. "A tragic heart failure in his sleep. Will be ghosts in the city of light." The lights slammed back on, but they were no longer the warm glow of chandeliers. Harsh industrial floodlight cut through the room, revealing dozens of the syndicate's elite guards standing in a silent, ironclad circle around the table. At the head of the circle stood Chairman Jae-hoon, his face a mask of ancestral rage.
Chloe scrambled to her feet, her chair clattering backward. "It's a lie! A fabrication!" she shrieked, her gaze darting toward the shadows. "Rodrigo, do something!" But Rodrigo was staring, paralyzed with horror, not at the guards, but at the man in the wheelchair. Jae-yoon stood up. He didn't use the armrests for support. He rose with a slow, predatory grace that sent a shockwave of terror through the traitors. He walked toward them, his steps firm and echoing on the marble, until he stood inches from Chloe's trembling form. Ashley stepped out from the shadows behind him, no longer the invisible maid, but a silent sentinel of justice, holding the tablet that had orchestrated their downfall. "Your French was always so beautiful, Chloe," Jae-yoon said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that filled the vacuum of the room. "In this house, even the shadows speak, and tonight they've told me everything." As the guards moved in to seize the pale, shaking traitors, Jae-yoon didn't look at the empire he had just saved. He looked at Ashley, the woman who had seen the truth when everyone else saw a ghost. The trap had snapped shut, and the only ones left standing were the king and the woman who had refused to let him fall. The aftermath of the confrontation left a heavy, electric silence in the grand hall, broken only by the muffled sobs of Chloe as the syndicate guards escorted her and a ghost-white Rodrigo toward the black sedans waiting in the rain. There were no dramatic gunshots, only the cold surgical removal of a cancer that had nearly consumed the Kong legacy. By dawn, the traitors were stripped of their stolen assets and sent into a permanent, guarded exile far from the glitz of Seoul or the dreams of Paris. They had wanted to be ghosts. Jae-yoon had simply granted them their wish. In the weeks that followed, the Kong estate underwent a transformation that mirrored its master. The wheelchair, once a symbol of perceived weakness, was moved into a storage room, a relic of a war won through patience. Jae-yoon moved through his halls with a newfound vigor, his every step a testament to the strength he had hidden for so long. Yet, as the business of the empire resumed, it was clear that the hierarchy had shifted. The staff no longer looked past Ashley Noble. They looked at her with a reverence that bordered on awe. She was no longer the woman in the black and white uniform. She was the architect of their survival. The grand wedding was held at the chairman's private coastal villa, a sprawling fortress of glass and stone overlooking the East Sea. It was an event that defied every tradition of the Korean underworld. There were no status-obsessed socialites or opportunistic vultures on the guest list, only the loyal few who had stood by the king when he was broken.
As the music swelled, Ashley appeared at the top of the marble staircase. She was a vision of breathtaking radiance, draped in a gown of ivory silk that complemented the rich mahogany glow of her skin. Her natural hair was adorned with a crown of rare black diamonds, a gift from the chairman himself, symbolizing her place as the new shield of the dynasty. Jae-yoon stood at the altar, his posture commanding and his dark eyes shimmering with a rare, vulnerable heat. When she reached him, he didn't offer a polite nod or a distant hand. He took both of her hands in his thumbs grazing her knuckles in a silent promise. "I spent my life looking for someone who wouldn't leave when the world turned dark," he whispered, his voice loud enough only for her to hear. "I didn't realize she was the one pouring my tea all along." Ashley smiled, a radiant, confident expression that reached her eyes. "You just needed someone who spoke your language, Jae-yoon." The chairman stood in the front row, his stern face softening into a look of profound approval. He had wanted a successor. He had found a power couple. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Jae-yoon pulled Ashley into a kiss that signaled the end of the deceptions and the beginning of a reign. The invisible maid had become the Mafia queen, and the broken boss had become a king reborn. Together, they didn't just rule an empire, they built a sanctuary where truth was the only currency and loyalty was the only law. Their story, which began in the shadows of a wheelchair and a secret recording, ended in the brilliant, unyielding light of a true partnership.